In a moment that may well define how history judges this turbulent chapter in American politics, some of the most senior military leaders ever to serve in the United States government have stepped forward with warnings that cut to the core of the republic itself, not as partisans, not as media personalities, but as career officers who spent decades in uniform under presidents of both parties, and who ultimately concluded that their oath to the Constitution required them to speak publicly about what they witnessed behind closed doors. At the heart of this extraordinary development are three men who occupied the highest positions in the American national security structure under Donald Trump. Former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley, former Secretary of Defense James Mattis, and former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly. Each was selected by Trump. Each served at his side. Each had direct access to his private decision-making in the Situation Room and in Oval Office meetings where the use of American military power was discussed. And each, in different but unmistakable terms, has since warned that the president they served posed a fundamental threat to the constitutional system they swore to defend. To understand the gravity of their statements, one must first understand the nature of the military oath in the United States. Unlike armies that swear allegiance to a monarch, a ruling party, or an individual leader, American service members pledged to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That distinction is not ceremonial. It is foundational. It defines the military as an institution, subordinate not to a personality, but to a framework of laws, checks and balances, and civilian control embedded in a written charter. When a chairman of the Joint Chiefs speaks about a president in terms usually reserved for foreign adversaries, it is not rhetorical flourish. It is an assessment filtered through decades of studying threats to democratic governance. Milley, who spent more than 40 years in uniform, commanding troops in combat and advising presidents across administrations, reportedly described Trump as fascist to the core and the most dangerous person to this country. Such language from the highest-ranking military officer in the United States is unprecedented in modern times. In military doctrine, a threat assessment is not made lightly. It involves patterns of behavior, intent, and capability. When Milley used the language of fascism, he was not engaging in cable news hyperbole. He was invoking a political model characterized by the subordination of institutions to a single leader, the cultivation of personal loyalty over constitutional duty, the vilification of opponents as enemies of the state, and the potential use of state power to suppress dissent. For a chairman of the Joint Chiefs to apply that framework to a sitting or former president signals a profound institutional alarm. Mattis, revered within the Marine Corps and widely respected across party lines, offered a different but equally stark warning. Confirmed as Secretary of Defense with overwhelming bipartisan support, he initially embodied the image of steady military professionalism inside an unconventional administration. Yet after resigning, he publicly accused Trump of making a mockery of the Constitution, asserting that the president failed to respect the rule of law and the principle that the military exists to defend the nation rather than serve the personal ambitions of its commander-in-chief. Mattis's criticism carried particular weight because of his long-standing reputation for restraint and discipline. He was not known for public political commentary. For him to conclude that the constitutional order itself was being undermined suggested that his concerns went far beyond policy disagreements over troop deployments or alliance management. Kelly's testimony may be the most emotionally resonant. A retired four-star Marine general and Gold Star father who lost his son in Afghanistan, Kelly confirmed reports that Trump disparaged fallen service members as suckers and losers and expressed interest in using the military against domestic political opponents. The significance of that claim extends beyond personal insult. The idea that a president would contemplate deploying the armed forces in a partisan domestic context strikes at the core of American civil military norms, which are built around the principle that the military is not an instrument of internal political coercion. Kelly's stature as both a senior officer and a bereaved parent lent moral authority to his words. He was not speaking abstractly about theory, but about the dignity of those who gave their lives in uniform. Taken together, the statements of Milley, Mattis, and Kelly form a rare convergence of alarm from the top tier of the national security establishment. These were not peripheral advisors or distant critics. They were central actors in the administration's most consequential decisions, privy to intelligence briefings, war plans, and internal deliberations. Their collective message was not framed as partisan opposition, but as constitutional concern. They described a president who, in their view, exhibited contempt for institutional constraints, sought personal loyalty over lawful process, and viewed the military less as a guardian of the republic than as a potential tool for political leverage. Beyond these three figures, hundreds of retired generals, admirals, diplomats, and intelligence officials have signed letters or issued statements expressing similar unease, creating an unusually broad and bipartisan chorus within the national security community. The political ramifications are substantial. Trump has long portrayed himself as an unwavering champion of the armed forces, frequently emphasizing defense spending increases, public displays of military pageantry, and rhetorical support for veterans. Yet the public dissent of his own hand-picked defense leaders complicates that narrative. When criticism comes from political rivals, it can be dismissed as partisan. When it comes from one's own former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of Defense, and Chief of Staff, it is harder to frame as mere opposition politics. For voters, particularly those with military ties, the question becomes less about ideological alignment and more about institutional integrity. If the very officers entrusted with advising the president on matters of war and peace concluded that he endangered constitutional norms, what does that imply about executive power and democratic resilience? The broader issue raised by these warnings concerns the delicate architecture of American governance. The Constitution disperses authority among three branches, establishes civilian control of the military, and embeds protections for dissent and minority rights. The framers anticipated ambition and faction. They designed a system meant to withstand both. But no document enforces itself. It depends on norms, on leaders who respect unwritten guardrails as well as written law, and on citizens who demand accountability. When senior military figures argue that those guardrails were tested in unprecedented ways, they are effectively sounding an alarm about the health of the system. It is important to note that civil-military relations in the United States traditionally emphasize political neutrality. Active duty officers rarely engage in overt political debate, and even retired generals have historically been cautious in criticizing former commanders-in-chief. The decision by these figures to speak publicly therefore represents a departure from custom, one they appear to justify as necessary in light of what they characterize as extraordinary circumstances. They frame their comments not as electoral endorsements, but as fulfillment of their oath, suggesting that silence would constitute complicity if they believed constitutional principles were at risk. Whether one agrees with their assessment or not, the fact that such high-ranking officials felt compelled to make it marks a significant moment. It underscores a tension at the heart of American democracy, the balance between robust political contestation and the preservation of shared institutional commitments. Supporters of Trump may argue that his confrontational style and aggressive rhetoric reflect disruption rather than authoritarianism, that unelected officials should not shape political outcomes, and that voters, not generals, decide elections. Critics counter that when those generals describe internal discussions about deploying troops domestically or disregarding legal constraints, the public has a right to weigh that testimony in evaluating leadership. Ultimately, the significance of these warnings lies not only in the specific allegations, but in the precedent they set. Democracies rely on peaceful transfers of power, respect for electoral outcomes, and adherence to the rule of law. If senior defense officials perceive those pillars as vulnerable, their duty, at least as they interpret it, extends beyond quiet resignation. They are appealing to the citizenry, the ultimate sovereign in the American system, to consider what kind of executive authority they are willing to entrust to any individual. The question transcends one personality. It touches on the durability of institutions designed to outlast any presidency. As the country moves forward, voters, lawmakers, and courts will grapple with competing narratives about this era. But the record will show that at a critical juncture, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the former Secretary of Defense, and the former White House Chief of Staff publicly declared that their oath to the Constitution compelled them to warn of danger from within. In a nation where the military's loyalty is pledged not to a ruler but to a document, such a declaration carries weight. What citizens choose to do with that warning, whether to view it as overreach, as patriotism, or as something in between, will shape not only electoral outcomes, but the evolving norms that define American democracy in the years ahead. The story does not end with their warnings. In many ways, that is where the deeper constitutional reckoning begins, because once senior officers of that stature publicly articulate concern about executive overreach, the focus inevitably shifts from personalities to guardrails, from campaign rhetoric to structural resilience. The American system was deliberately constructed to prevent the concentration of power in any one branch, much less in a single individual, yet it also depends on self-restraint and shared commitment to democratic norms. When figures like Mark Milley, James Mattis, and John Kelly speak in unusually stark terms, they are effectively arguing that those informal norms were strained to a degree they had not witnessed before. That raises an unavoidable question. What happens when institutional actors believe that traditional internal checks, private counsel, interagency process, legal review, are insufficient to constrain presidential impulses? Historically, presidents have clashed with military leaders over strategy and policy. Such tension is not only normal, but healthy in a civilian-led system. What makes this episode distinct is the claim that the conflict was not merely about troop levels or alliances, but about the very nature of constitutional governance. If a commander-in-chief is perceived as prioritizing personal loyalty over constitutional obligation, the implications extend beyond any single decision. It reframes debates about executive authority, emergency powers, and the permissible scope of domestic military involvement. The framers of the Constitution, wary of standing armies and executive ambition, embedded safeguards such as congressional war powers and the posse comitatus principle, limiting domestic deployment of federal troops. When senior defense officials suggest that these boundaries were tested in spirit, if not in letter, it invites scrutiny of how resilient those safeguards truly are under political stress. Supporters of strong executive leadership argue that decisive authority is essential in moments of crisis, and that accusations of authoritarianism often reflect ideological disagreement rather than genuine danger. Critics respond that the durability of democracy lies precisely in the willingness of leaders to accept constraint, even when they possess the legal latitude to push further. In this tension lies the broader lesson. Institutions survive not only because of written rules, but because of a culture of constitutional fidelity shared across parties and branches. The military's role in that culture is uniquely sensitive. It must remain apolitical, yet it must also remain loyal to the constitutional framework above any office holder. When retired generals conclude that silence would be inconsistent with that loyalty, they step into contested civic territory, risking accusations of politicization, while insisting that their intervention is itself an act of constitutional defense. The long-term consequence of such a moment may not be immediate electoral impact, but a recalibration of civil-military expectations. Future presidents may encounter a defense establishment more alert to perceived encroachments, more inclined to document dissent, and more conscious of the line between obedience and complicity. Lawmakers, too, may revisit statutory guardrails governing emergency powers and domestic troop use, seeking clarity where ambiguity once sufficed. For citizens, the episode underscores a sobering reality. Democratic preservation is not automatic. It requires vigilance not only from elected officials, but from institutions and individuals prepared to assert principle over proximity to power. Whether one views the warnings as justified alarm or as overstatement, their existence signals that internal confidence within the national security leadership was shaken in a way rarely seen in modern American history. Democracies are tested not only by external adversaries, but by internal strains, polarization, distrust, and the temptation to equate personal victory with national interest. The measure of endurance lies in whether those strains prompt renewal or erosion. In the end, the constitutional system remains in the hands of the electorate, interpreted by courts, overseen by Congress, and defended, when necessary, by those who have sworn to protect it. The significance of this chapter will ultimately be judged not by the intensity of the rhetoric, but by the resilience of the institutions that weathered it, and by whether future leaders absorb the lesson that power in a republic is strongest when it is restrained by law rather than amplified by loyalty to any one individual.